Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. I'm Jack Tolbert, and today I'm joined by Damien Zachlod, the Managing Director of EnBW UK. Damien, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to see you.
Brilliant. Damien, obviously the theme of our podcast is to discuss the future of public affairs, and you are quite an unusual guest in a very good way, in the sense that you are not a seasoned public affairs professional like quite a lot of the people we've spoken to on this podcast. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. For the benefit of our listeners here, your experience is really quite vast. You are a qualified management accountant. You worked for 10 years at EDF and 10 years at Vestas Offshore Wind in a range of commercial roles before becoming the MD of the EnBW UK. So really interested to hear from you in terms of what your thoughts, perceptions of politics and public affairs are or have been, and how they've evolved.
Thank you. It's a very good point. When you asked me to join the podcast, I had the same reflection. I'm not a public affairs professional, and let's see what I have to say about this. But largely, my experience over the last couple of years has been positive. If I'm honest, before joining EnBW, the public affairs side was an area that seemed far away. I've been very commercial, working on contract negotiations, closing commercial deals. And in that world, public affairs, politicians, it is very far away. So although policy is important, it hasn't ever been a core part of my role. So joining EnBW, I'm now sort of leading the representative office for the UK. And it's been an area where I've had to get up the learning curve very quickly, I have to say. And it's something that I've really enjoyed. And my first reflection that I would share is it shouldn't be underestimated how important it is. That actually the external perception of a business and the ability to influence policy in an area like renewable energy where we operate, it's something that really shouldn't be underestimated. And I have to say I would have been guilty of underestimating it before I started to work in this area. I
think that's good news for us as politics people and for the profession more broadly. Can we talk a little bit about before you got to EnBW? You mentioned that the majority of your time was focused on commercial agreements. Did you have a perception of politics back then, or kind of through the course of your experience?
I think having studied business, and so I think politics has always been something that's on the edge of my world. I would say it's something, having sort of studied in the 90s, there was a lot of discussion around the impact of Margaret Thatcher. And I remember studying that in my degree. There was a book at the time, Margaret Thatcher, Economic, is it myth or reality? So it was quite interesting to sort of see the different perspectives. And I think largely I'm somebody that I'm looking for achieving objectives. And sort of for me, the outcome is sometimes more important than the journey, although the journey is important. And that means that largely if the outcome's right, I don't have an ideology that I must follow to take me to that. I'm sort of ideologically flexible in that way. I would say, in this new world where I'm more involved in politics, I'm sort of the classic swing voter rather than heavily following one party or another.
Okay. And since you've joined EnBW, can you talk me through and our listeners through a bit about your engagement with politics and public affairs and how that's come about?
Yeah. So EnBW, we're a state-owned utility, German. So the UK part of the business is here in the UK, we're developing 3 large offshore wind farms with our JV partner, which is now Gerenex BP. But in Germany, we're a fully integrated utility, 27,000 people, and very deeply rooted in Baden-Württemberg, the southern states of Germany. But here in the UK, we just aren't very well known, haven't been very well known, and don't really have a voice in the game. So largely what I was faced with is building something from scratch. And I was very successful bringing in a very talented public affairs professional who does know the ropes of this very well. And he's done a great job in helping me guide the strategy here, because it's largely been around, as a renewable energy developer, what are the needs? We're here to de-risk the projects as much as we can. Germany is far away and they need to understand how things are moving in the UK markets and how that can have an impact on the projects that we're looking to make huge investments in. So largely it's been this case of, personally, to keep it concrete, it's always been for me about what can we do to de-risk these projects. But then you come into the area of public affairs, which is very much around building network, understanding how things are moving. And that's where I really understood that value of, it takes a long time for a policy to pop out. And in that period, there's quite a lot of time to talk about actually, okay, how do we like that policy to be? And how do we work to try and bring something that can work well for the business and the projects?
Okay. In terms of your time in the last couple of years at EnBW, can you talk me through some of the things you've experienced when it comes to the public affairs that you've maybe never experienced before in your career?
So I think the first thing to talk about there is always conference season. I think this is something in industry, you will have your one or two big conferences a year, but first of all, they're during the week. So conference season is always that eye opener with them being opening up weekends for the members to join. And I think it's I hadn't expected, I didn't really know what I was walking into the first time I went to one. And I would say that sort of full on panel events, bilateral meetings, trying to get attention of the people that are trying to meet people is very difficult. These things are huge with panel events everywhere, with receptions everywhere. It's sort of I'd heard the story of how it is, but they're long days. It's really they're long days going deep into the night, trying to meet the right people. And I must admit that was I was nervous going into the first one, but I was very happy having come through the first one and sort of thinking, okay, this is quite an interesting. You see the value of being in that place and trying to get to the right people and have those important conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll probably talk about party conferences a little bit later on in the episode, because they certainly are an interesting dynamic. Are there any other either events or maybe even exposure Parliament directly that you've experienced?
It's good to move me there as well, because I think actually like the whole process of the parliamentary subcommittees, the workings of Parliament has been something that I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to. So how a bill is formed, how to sort of join the parliamentary, the APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups. And so it's quite interesting to sort of find the right areas that are supporting the business and then sort of look to engage through these different mechanisms that I just hadn't seen. And of course, there's something unique about meeting politicians and meeting ministers and secretary of states that you don't have in sort of day-to-day business. You always kind of have an equal discussion, but there's something different about meeting the big cats of politics.
And is that a status thing?
I think it's knowing that you're very much in a situation in a commercial deal. It's easy to say no, and you keep working a point until you can find an agreement. But actually, you don't have that iterative process with a minister or a secretary of state. You're sort of landing a message, but whether they listen to the message or not, there's no sort of clear outcome. So I think it's that piece of not being the uncertainty around you land a message, but actually how can that be implemented?
Okay.
And I think the other side of it is in a commercial deal, you're looking at something from two perspectives, either side of the contract. When you speak with a minister, we always have to consider the political implications of the discussion point. So although you are trying to get an agreement with somebody, you need to understand that agreement will be looked at by a number of different stakeholders from different lenses. So trying to assimilate your key messages in a way that can be played through to other audiences, which is obviously when they're voted in, it's a very important point. So it's an additional complexity, I would say, rather than a status thing necessarily.
Okay, that's really interesting. May come back to a couple of thoughts on that a bit later. With your very recent exposure to public affairs, I'm fascinated by, as a business leader, where it ranks, may not necessarily in kind of a metric sense, but in terms of there must be so much going on for you on a day-to-day. You have directors and people to report to in multiple geographies. You've obviously got public affairs, you've got resources, you've got AI, which we'll talk about later. You've got all of these things in your mind as a business leader, as well as the operational side of running a business and the strategic side. Are you able to give us a sense of where public affairs fits into your thinking more broadly as a business leader?
So where the key thing I learned, luckily quite quickly when I joined this role, is when we look at the projects, when you're running a renewable energy project, huge capital investments, there needs to be the right framework in place. So actually public affairs sits as a key lever for me in terms of trying to ensure that as a broader group, we can meet our objectives here to invest in renewable energy. So I would say it's, from a time perspective, I'm very fortunate to have a very strong team that can do the day-to-day, but it is something that when they need me, I make sure I can make myself available, because it is landing these messages, having the right person in the room for different discussions, whether that be me or somebody from Germany. We try to make sure that we play this in a way that shows the seriousness of this investment to the broader EnBW organization as well as the UK organization when we're discussing this with the key stakeholders and decision makers.
Okay, thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about technology now, if that's okay. A lot of the discussions on this podcast have been about how we think AI is going to impact public affairs as a profession. Now, obviously, as a business leader, I imagine AI is something that you think about. Can you give us an idea of, broadly speaking, what your thoughts are on AI in general and what your thoughts are on how AI might impact public affairs?
So first of all, I think AI is something that I wish I had more time to think about. It is something that I see the benefits, but trying to explore those benefits and implement those benefits is something that I struggle a bit more with personally. But I think when I look at the ability to get summarized information from many sources in a very fast way, this can only help us in terms of, for me, public affairs and generally business. It's a game of relationships. It's a game of people. This is very, that is how you get things done and how you achieve things. You need people speaking to each other. So I don't see that disappearing. And I think but what I do see is AI can enable us to spend less time doing the reactive monitoring. It can enable us to ensure that we spend more time on the real high value topics. So it is, I think, a real opportunity for public affairs. Of course, there's still a lot to do, and I think it doesn't fully replace people because we all know that ChatGPT and other AI tools they have hallucinations. So there's a lot of work to do around making sure that the messaging that comes from AI actually reflects the business and the culture of the business. I think that's a key point, but also accuracy. It's accuracy. There's some really sort of basic pieces there. So I see real opportunity in AI more generally, and then in public affairs, we can move from manual monitoring, which is time consuming, towards real-time alerts. If we set the right things, we can move from generic messaging towards more tailored messaging. If we know our stakeholders, then actually we're able to get tailored messaging, and we can put that messaging through different frames. So as a renewable energy developer, for us, it's around the positive economic impact that offshore wind can have in the UK. But similarly, there's an innovation net zero angle that we can talk through. And then there's the energy security angle of we're not exposed to Russian gas, for example. But different audiences want a different mix of that. So although the messaging is based from one place, you have the ability to tailor that messaging much more quickly, much more efficiently. But of course, you still need the people that understand the business and understand the sort of the stakeholders to enable us to sort of really make sure that is the right messaging for each stakeholder.
The point about different audiences is something I just want to dig into a little, because I tend to agree with your observations on AI, particularly in public affairs. Do you have a view at all on how political stakeholders, so I'm talking your civil servants, your MPs, particularly those in government jobs, do you have a view at all on how they might utilize AI and how it might impact the way that they work?
So my understanding is it's already being used.
Yeah.
And I think in similar, in the way that I'm looking for that perfect tool that can summarize all of the things I need to read and give me a daily digest, then I'm sure that's the same thing happening. So they will be, policymakers are already using it very, very much around sort of drafting and summarizing documents as we use it in other areas. But also I think they can, specifically in the area of consultation and policy setting, there is a real opportunity here when they receive all of the policy consultation responses, then they're able to summarize that and process that much more quickly. So what I see is, in some ways, as being a business, we need to respond to the fact that policy cycles can be shortened by AI, and therefore we need to be ready more quickly. There's not sort of time to spend too much time navel gazing. We need to understand the stakeholders. We need to understand their objectives with the policy, and then try and make sure that we are processing and ready with not just a good argument, but actually I think AI is moving us to a more data-driven world where this ability to process information from numerous sources means that as business, we need to make sure that our arguments are more data-driven and actually that our arguments can be read in the right way by AI. So the example I always give is, if you look at recruitment, pre LinkedIn, recruitment was much more people, and now it's still people, but you have this front end piece where the keywords on your CV will decide whether you get found by a recruiter or not. And largely, I think we see the same thing starting to play out in the policy phase, which is you need to understand how the AI is searching, so you can make sure that your points are understood by the AI and then summarized in the right way by the AI.
Okay. It's a really interesting mix around using the tools for efficiency whilst also maintaining the human element, which is something it's going to be really interesting to observe that play out in reality, because I think going back to what you said right early on in the episode around getting outcomes or getting the right outcomes, and by doing that it's linked to the perception you have as a business and also your ability to influence it. I think how all of those blend together is going to be the thing to watch.
Agree.
Yeah. Okay. Any other views or thoughts at all on either what you've learned about public affairs recently, or thoughts on how the profession might have to evolve?
So moving forwards, I mean, I've spoken a bit about AI there. I think what I start to see play out, and actually one of the things, again, is very much the human impact of AI, because I think for those of us that are in these roles already, you can look at AI and say, fabulous, I can get my information very fast, computer processed, it's coming through with the right quality, as long as somebody's checking the verifying the data, making sure that it's still running in the right way, then it's really helpful. But I think what concerns me on the human side is I had the opportunity to, as a management accountant, I had the opportunity to work in the finance department and learn the hard way, or learn at the coalface, how a business runs and how the financial flows of the business help you understand the system and understand what a business is running. And that was invaluable. And my worry is if these entry level jobs start to disappear because AI is doing that work for us, then we need to find a new way of developing skills. And that's a challenge for business, it's a challenge for government. As this moves, we will need to understand, how do we get the experienced people that have the ability to check whether the AI is right or wrong? But where are those mistakes? Where are those things not matching the company ethics, the company culture? And that's my sort of slight, it's one of the things I worry about. Obviously, it's more a 15, 20-year look ahead, but it is a key, it is something that I think we need to understand. How are we going to continue to develop the schools? Is there a change of education system required? I don't know.
Well, this is one of the points that I definitely see being raised outside of public affairs, but it impacts public affairs. And you've articulated it very well. Ultimately, if entry-level jobs aren't there anymore, then how are people meant to get the knowledge and the experience and arguably the discipline to be able to be effective in the workplace? And then if you take a step back and think about it holistically, what impact does that have on workforce when you're looking at developing talent, when you're looking at workforce planning from a HR angle, and also shifting it ever so slightly? Does this mean that our education system is going to have to change? Because if people at the early are getting the experience, the exposure at that kind of post-uni level, then where are they going to get it? So does that mean that the education is going to have to change? And is there going to be more of an emphasis on, the word I'm looking for here is like degree workplace degrees, apprenticeships, graduate apprenticeships, etc.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is something we can't ignore, because there is a danger, having spoken to friends of mine that don't work in public affairs by any stretch, but there is a danger here that you reach a certain point, as you say, maybe in 20 years' time, where you don't have the workforce to be able to operate. And that does apply to public affairs, because if your entry-level jobs, in whether that's working in an MP's office or working in a monitoring organisation, how are you going to be placed to then go into the industry more broadly? It's a really interesting topic.
No, I agree. And it's, I wish I had the answer, Jack. Fortunately, we have a little bit of time to work it through, but I think it's something, this is one of those knock-on effects of the use of more AI, as the use of AI increases, this is one of those knock-on effects. And so far, when these technology changes have happened, if we take a look at the invention of the ATM, for example, there was a lot of concern about jobs being lost in banks because people were going in to withdraw money. And actually what happened is the banks were able to come with a higher value, more customer focused offering. And the bank branches didn't close at that point. So it was sort of one of those things where there was a reskilling and there was a new target. And I think that this will be what we need to figure out. Is it used to be done? We used to learn things one way, but that doesn't mean there isn't a different way of learning those skills.
Yeah.
But it is something that but it's not just a UK topic. As humanity, we're going to need to try and figure out how we get this balance right.
Yeah. Well, we're going slightly off topic of public affairs here, but I think it's relevant because let me give you a real world example. I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old niece and nephew. And even now I can see that the way that they are going to learn is going to be seismically different to the way that my sister and I learn when it comes to education, let alone everything else. And it's little things like, I take the mick out of my mom for doing this, but my mom will, when there's big events, like for example, the Queen's funeral, my mom will save the newspapers because she wants in the future to be able to show my niece and nephew that this is actually how we used to get our information and so on and so forth, and how that's going to evolve in humanity more broadly and also public affairs is to a certain extent unknown. And I think the adaptability that the profession is going to have to enact is going to be pretty big.
Yeah, but I guess I always come back to, but it will still be people meeting people. Yeah, in the end, there will still be, the ministers will be people. So it will be public affairs professionals dealing with people. So it is, they'll be getting their information in a different way, but still, that remaining true to a business and its business and the business objectives, and actually how those objectives can be delivering something which is also of use to the country more generally. And I think there's still, in some ways, everything will change, but almost nothing will change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with the analogy. Everything will change maybe in how you do things, potentially when you look at public affairs, but ultimately it will largely still be a people-to-people business, people-to-people kind of sector. So yeah, okay, really interesting. Any other thoughts on either what you've learned so far in the last couple of years working with public affairs in a closer proximity, or thoughts on the future for public affairs?
So I think for me, as I've said before, the key lesson I've taken away is the importance of public affairs, and that's as a stream to sort of meeting what a business is trying to achieve. So that's always sort of the thing that remains front and center with me is I can be a bit cynical at times, and it was always something where I sort of looked at it and said, okay, it's talking shops. But that sort of actually, I've really enjoyed the process of, there is a certain amount, there are a lot of people trying to get different voices and opinions into things, and therefore that extra challenge of, well, how do I make my statement more relevant or more sort of meeting the other person's objectives. So I think I've always viewed, both as I've come through business and now when I'm working in public affairs, I view this as, how do you try and develop a joint win with something? So it's, if you're negotiating a contract, you're trying to make a point where the customer's getting what they want, but also the supplier gets what they want. And I think it's the same thing in a slightly different way. The business is trying to achieve an objective. So for us, build offshore wind farms, but the government is getting economic investment. The government is getting sort of green energy and increased energy security. So it's this piece of always trying to look at something from different perspectives. And for me, it's an important perspective, the how you deliver something that is seen as value to the politicians and the broader electorate is an important topic.
Yeah, the cynic in me would say that some politicians may not necessarily do something unless they understand how it benefits them. But maybe I'll get Ollie to edit that bit out.
The cynic would also say some businesses won't do anything unless they can figure out.
Well, this is it, and it's really good to hear the articulation of what you've just said, because I think another element, this isn't journalism, but another element of public affairs is storytelling. And I think if you can proactively engage with somebody on a level which they understand, and they understand your perspective, and they understand what your proposal is and how it's going to benefit them, that seems to me like you're covering the right bases.
And I think it's actually a large, I read a fabulous book called The Storytelling Animal, and I'm afraid I can't remember the author, but it's sort of the story of humans and how we became this storytelling animal. But that's worth a read if you can find the time.
Yeah, I'm noting it down as we speak. Really good. We're going to have to move on, obviously, because of time. One of my final questions is a little bit about your advice to fellow business leaders. If there are business leaders out there that maybe don't either understand much about what their public affairs function does or doesn't understand politics more broadly, what advice would you share with them now and kind of moving forward about the value of public affairs?
So I think it's always a question of business size. So I think for small businesses, obviously it's very difficult because they're often, they don't have the scale. I'm quite fortunate that I'm running a small business here in the UK, but part of a much bigger organization in Germany, and that enables us to be able to invest in this, because I think my view of public affairs is a key if you're working in an industry which is largely around driving a policy agenda for the country, and renewable energy is such an industry. So I think if I take a step back, what I would say is, what are the objectives of the business? Is it solely customer, or is it meeting another requirement? And if that requirement is aligned with a policy agenda, then I would say it's crucial that you invest in a public affairs function, because you need to be able to understand if there's a change of government, then what's the impact on the policy area that you're serving. So I'm largely, and of course, when we look ahead, if we look at the polls right now, then this is exactly the sort of question of, okay, as renewable energy in a world where we could see a reform government in the future, then obviously we need to start thinking about that already. And the importance of public affairs is making sure you're prepared for a change of government if a change of government comes, because as business, you need to work with all parties. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Before we move on to the more lighter questions to finish, Damien, do you have any other kind of thoughts or reflections at all, either on your time in business, your perception on how public affairs might have changed, or what you've learned over the last couple of years?
I think I've got across most of the things that I've learned, particularly in the public affairs field. I think it's generally, I view it as a rounding out of experience, having worked in accounting and then worked in business development and then supply on the developer side, so developing projects, and then working in the supply chain and then back to the developer side. I feel I have many different ways of looking at a problem. Yeah, with a business degree and accounting qualification and the experience that I've had working in sales and other areas, I have many different ways of looking at a problem, and public affairs gives me another lens with which to look at a problem. So I think it's, as a rounding out of perspective, I'm very happy to be able to look at something from different areas and try to understand, okay, what's the messaging in different ways. So in some ways, I think maybe I was a natural public affairs person without knowing it and without ever sort of being exposed or interested in politics. So it was sort of one of these things where as I've landed in it, I thought, actually, I view it as quite similar to sales in some ways, but obviously with a different thing. Instead of selling a product or a service, you're now sort of selling an idea, and that's you're trying to get that idea to catch. And so it's quite a philosophical, sort of quite philosophically rewarding in that way. So I think that's something I've really enjoyed in the last couple of years.
Thank you. That's definitely something for me to reflect on. I think I tend to agree with what you said. With my experience, I think it goes back to landing the message. I think if you can land the message with the relevant stakeholder, irrespective of whether you're in a sales job or a public affairs job, I think that is the job, right? So if you can do that and take into consideration everything we've discussed and more things, it will stand you in good stead.
And I think delivering a message and landing a message, this is a completely transferable skill that is important in all aspects of a leader's role. So if it's sort of been one of those things, it's been quite good for me to have that. That when you're talking to a minister, then you need to be sharp. The message needs to be concise. It needs to land, but it also needs to needs to be clear enough that it's not misunderstood. So there's something in that which is, it's really like quite a pressurized end of sort of developing that message and making sure that you get it right and making sure that it's thought through from different perspectives. And I think that has really helped me in the other areas that I'm managing.
Thank you, Damien. Any other thoughts at all before we move on to the final questions?
No, I'll let you move on.
Okay. So much for me to reflect on there, Damien. Thank you for coming in. Before we let you go, we always finish with a few lighter questions for our guests. They are predominantly aimed at a public affairs kind of audience. So I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts are. So we touched on party conferences earlier. Do you have a particular favourite memory or best experience of your time?
It's a very good question. I think I think my favorite memory actually is as somebody that sat outside of politics and maybe not had the most positive impression of politicians and how that plays, particularly going through things like the expenses scandal. It's been one of the things I've enjoyed most is there's a lot of really decent people working in public affairs and politics. It's sort of quite easy to look at lobbyists and all of these things as a bit of a bête noire. But I think it's been, for me, what I've really enjoyed is sort of coming into this area. There's a lot of very good people trying to achieve the right things. And that's been, so from my perspective, it's been quite nice to sort of to see that and to sort of just get that feeling. And I've been at dinners where you sort of, there's an understanding, everybody's trying to deliver their message, but actually there's still quite often an element of fun involved in that. And that's quite that's something that's important to me. I like to have a joke while we're doing things.
Well, it certainly makes the days go quicker and it helps with the relationship side. So thank you. Next question. And I'm particularly interested to hear this because you made a really good point earlier about business is always going to have to work with government. It doesn't matter which party is in government, but business is always going to have to work with government. And with your cynical view of politicians, as you just referenced, do you have a favourite prime minister?
I have to say, not really. I studied history A-level. And I sort of remember being quite interested in sort of like in some of the very early, so the period was at the early 1800s. So I think Robert Peel is always one that jumps to mind. And then obviously as you move on through Disraeli, Gladstone, a lot of things. But I think not having a huge party allegiance, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. And I think I see there's been a lot of very strong prime ministers, a lot of good prime ministers, but as they achieve things, there's always a flip side. And because I'm trying to look at things from different perspectives, I don't think I really have a favourite, I'm afraid.
Okay. Wow, that's a very political answer, which is very, very well delivered. Well done, Damien. And my final question is, looking ahead to the future, the domestic landscape in the UK is what it is. As we're recording this on the 23rd of September, just before we go to conferences. If there was one person who isn't a politician, who you've worked with, whether that's a fellow business leader or someone you've worked with that isn't a politician, is there anyone that stands out who you think could be really, really good if they were put in the right government department, or dare I say it, anyone that that could be a really good prime minister?
I always go into the humour side. I always sort of think I'm, just as an example of my not being overly interested in politics, I'm currently watching Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. I'm finally watching them years later. And so I sort of, as half of a joke, I sort of want to say either, Jim Hacker or Sir Humphrey as a potential prime minister, but obviously they're not real people. So who do I think, again, stay on the light-hearted side? There's an element of maybe someone like Sir Alan Sugar. I like the idea of being a prime minister saying like, you're fired. You haven't delivered, you're fired. But it's not the way that the civil service works. It's not the way the civil service should work. So I do definitely say that in jest.
Okay. I think there's maybe something to be said about getting more people from business into frontline politics. There's probably some more work that everyone could do on that to push things forward. Damien, thank you so much for coming in. It's been really good to see you. My thanks as always to my colleague Ollie Foster, our in-house producer. Perhaps you have a view on the future of public affairs and you'd like to share it, or perhaps you'd like to add to the discussion yourself. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of de Havilland and Forefront.